My wife stood in the shower, mid-rinse, her hair lathered in bubbles and her face half covered in foam, when the water just stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. She screamed my name like the house was on fire, slipping on the wet tile as she scrambled to grab a towel. I ran upstairs thinking she'd seen a spider the size of a football, only to find her standing there, eyes burning with soap, yelling that there was no water coming from the taps. Not just in the shower, everywhere. Kitchen sink, bathroom sink, even the garden hose. Dry as dust. My first instinct was a plumbing failure. I headed out to the front yard and found the real problem. Our water line had been neatly, surgically cut. A bright orange notice flapped in the breeze, staked into the ground by our busted main. Unauthorized water access terminated by HOA directive. That was the moment I knew the Homeowners Association had no idea what kind of storm they'd just triggered. Because what they didn't know was simple and dangerous. The lake that fed their entire water system, the very same lake they'd been pumping from for years, the one they claimed was common property, wasn't common at all. It was mine. I owned it. Every drop. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit me as I crouched next to the severed pipe. We weren't behind on any payments. We weren't stealing water. In fact, we'd never needed their permission in the first place. Karen Wilbur, the president of the HOA, had recently started a campaign to crack down on so-called violations, declaring herself the protector of community standards, like she was some self-appointed sheriff in a neighborhood with barely 40 homes and one coffee shop. She'd already fined people for mismatched curtains, garden gnomes, and even a trampoline. But cutting someone's water without notice? That was next level. I marched over to the HOA office, which was just a converted garage in Karen's oversized beige house. The office reeked of popery and self-importance. She sat behind a desk that had at least 3 laminated copies of the HOA charter on it, sipping tea like she was the queen of suburbia. I didn't bother knocking. She looked up with a smirk that could sour milk. I told her they'd cut my line, and she simply nodded, as if it were an overdue task she'd finally checked off her list. She slid a folder across the desk with a printed screenshot of a satellite view, highlighting the pipe that led from the back of my property into the neighborhood distribution point. According to her, that was an unauthorized connection. According to me, it was the exact opposite. I calmly asked if she had reviewed the county water rights documents before making her decision. Her smile vanished for a second before snapping back like a rubber band. She said she didn't need to, that everything beyond the HOA-owned lots was communal land, and any connections needed board approval. That's when I dropped the bomb. I leaned over and told her, word for word, "Karen, you're drinking from my lake. The entire community is. You just cut the line that brings water to the one house with legal ownership of the source. I hope your hydrangeas enjoy the drought." She blinked. Once, twice, then scoffed and waved me off like I was bluffing. I turned and left without another word. I wasn't bluffing, and she was about to find that out the hard way. Back home, I pulled the old files from my safe. A few years ago, I had purchased a tract of land that came with what most people considered a useless pond. But that pond was actually a small natural lake with a deep aquifer underneath it. The HOA, desperate to avoid rising municipal water costs, had quietly routed a pumping system to feed off it for years. I never charged them, never complained, and never even brought it up, because my own access ran separately and I genuinely didn't mind. Until now. A call to my lawyer confirmed everything I needed. The original easement agreement predated the HOA's founding and clearly outlined my ownership of the water rights, including supply control. It even granted me the authority to restrict access if the terms were violated, which they now were, thanks to Karen's little crusade. The next day, I took a stroll down to the lake's valve station, a small fenced area tucked behind some brush where the HOA's pumps connected to the intake lines. I stood there a while, listening to the faint hum of the waterworks, imagining the chaos if I simply turned the valve. But no, I wasn't going to do that. Not yet. I wanted them to understand what they had done before they tasted the consequences. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done gloating. She had posted a triumphant announcement in the neighborhood app with a selfie beside the broken pipe. No more freeloaders. HOA takes water theft seriously. The comments were a mix of claps and confused emojis. People didn't even realize their water source was tied to that line. I decided it was time for some clarity. I posted one photo, a high-resolution image of my deed, signed, dated, and stamped by the county clerk with the caption, "Funny thing about lakes, when you own them, you decide who gets to drink." It went viral in the neighborhood within minutes. Suddenly my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors asking if it was true. Some furious at Karen. Others just worried they were going to lose water too. I told them I wasn't cutting anyone off yet. But if the HOA didn't reverse course and repair my line immediately, that decision would change. Karen responded with arrogance as always, accusing me of trying to blackmail the board and vowing to report me to the county. I welcomed it. In fact, I even offered to email her my lawyer's number. She declined. That night, as I sat on my porch overlooking the moonlit lake, my wife handed me a glass of wine and asked what I was going to do. I told her I'd already started. The shutoff would come, but not yet. First, I wanted them to throw a party. A big one. The kind that needed lots of water. Because sometimes you don't just flip the switch. You let the fools turn on all the lights first, then pull the plug when they're blindest. Karen had no idea the fuse was already lit. And when the water stopped flowing, it wouldn't just be a minor inconvenience. It would be a flood of consequences, one they brought on themselves. The morning after my post went live in the community group chat, the entire neighborhood was buzzing like a kicked beehive. People weren't just curious anymore. They were confused, annoyed, and increasingly aware that the HOA may have stepped in something far bigger than an unauthorized water pipe. I watched from my kitchen window as residents walked past, some pausing at the broken pipe where Karen's little orange stake still stood like a monument to stupidity. One neighbor even stopped to take a selfie with it, shaking his head. By noon, my inbox had 30 messages from residents asking if it was true that I owned the lake. I didn't bother answering them directly. The truth was already leaking faster than the HOA's PR spin could contain it. While Karen continued her campaign of silence in the app, she didn't know I was 2 steps ahead. That morning, I met with my old college friend Mitch, who now worked as a civil engineer for the county. We met for coffee under the pretense of catching up, but as soon as the greetings were done, I slid over a copy of the deed and the easement documents. Mitch scanned them and gave a low whistle. He told me not only was the HOA's pump station on land I legally controlled, but their main water lines were all routed through a path that violated updated environmental code. That was a juicy bonus I hadn't even counted on. Mitch offered to send a copy of the survey report and noted that if I wanted to restrict or shut off access, the county couldn't stop me, not unless there was an emergency, which, given the HOA's arrogance, was unlikely to come from their side. Later that day, I walked down to the pump station. It was nothing fancy, just a fenced area with a pair of pumps feeding into the main line that branched into the neighborhood. I had the only master valve key. Technically, it wasn't required to shut things off. There was a cutoff system installed just a few feet upstream, but it felt satisfying to hold that solid chunk of brass in my hand like I was holding their fate. I wasn't ready to twist it yet. Timing was everything. Back at home, I drew up a little blueprint. The plan was simple. Shut off the flow not when they expected it but when they needed it most. Not just to make a point, but to let the pain echo. They needed to feel it, not just see it. If I turned off their water right after the pipe was cut, Karen would have spun the narrative that I was retaliating. But if I waited until she set the stage for something grand, she'd bury herself in her own foolishness. My opportunity came faster than I expected. That evening, Karen posted a smug announcement. The HOA would be hosting a summer kickoff celebration that Saturday, complete with food trucks, a water balloon fight, dunk tanks, and a children's inflatable water slide. The entire event was built on the assumption that water would flow freely. I nearly choked on my drink when I read the details. I couldn't have planned it better myself. It was like she handed me a script and begged me to pull the plug at the exact moment the dunk tank lever dropped. Friday night, I walked the lake perimeter just after dusk. The air was still, and the lake shimmered under the moonlight. I stopped at the control box, an old steel cabinet tucked near the inlet where the HOA's pipe branched out from the mainline. I had added a timer system that could be remotely activated. At exactly 1 p.m. Saturday, the valve would close and water to the neighborhood would stop dead. Their emergency systems would still have minimal flow. That part was critical in case anything truly urgent happened, but all lawn sprinklers, outdoor spigots, and even indoor plumbing tied to the secondary lines would go dry. I wasn't leaving them in danger, just in deep, embarrassing discomfort. Saturday arrived hot and bright, perfect weather for a summer bash. I took a lawn chair out onto my front yard and sipped lemonade while I watched cars roll into the community park just 2 streets down. Kids ran past with pool noodles and water balloons, and 2 giant inflatable slides rose like colorful towers from the grass. I couldn't help but admire the setup. It really was the kind of event that needed water like lungs needed air. Karen strutted around the event like she was the mayor of a small town, beaming at parents, directing the DJ, and giving the local taco truck guy orders like she was his boss. A few people noticed me and waved hesitantly. They weren't sure if I was the villain or the hero yet. That would change in a few minutes. At precisely 1 p.m., I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. It took a few seconds, then a minute. I counted slowly in my head. First came the sputtering. A few people noticed the dunk tank wasn't filling right. Then a mom yelled from the water slide line that the spray jets had stopped. Kids were slipping and sticking on the hot vinyl, wailing as they lost momentum halfway down. The balloon refill stations went bone dry. The DJ's mic cut out mid-sentence when the cooling fans shut off. Confusion turned to panic as homeowners started getting texts from back home that the sinks and toilets weren't working either. Karen's face was a masterpiece. 1 minute she was basking in admiration. The next, she was frowning at the dunk tank, then walking briskly to a small crowd gathered around the now dry slide. People demanded answers. Some blamed the city. A few pointed at me. I sat calmly in my lawn chair, sipping lemonade like I was watching a Netflix drama unfold in real time. The final straw came when the fire marshal, who happened to be a resident, stepped in to ask what backup plan was in place for the sudden water outage. Karen stammered. She tried calling the pump operator, but the HOA never had one. They just flipped a switch and assumed nature would do the rest. I waited until the confusion reached a peak, then stood up and walked over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, that their water had been shut off legally by the owner of the lake. I held up a laminated copy of the deed, just like a stage magician pulling out the final reveal. The silence was deafening. A woman near the taco truck gasped. A kid dropped his half-filled balloon. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But no words came out. I said I'd be happy to restore water access, under the condition that the HOA repaired my severed pipe, issued a formal apology, and acknowledged the lake's ownership publicly. I gave them 24 hours to respond. Then I turned and walked away as a man near the grill yelled that someone better get Karen out of charge before she turned the entire town into a desert. Back at my porch, I sat down and waited. The ball was in their court now. But by the looks on their faces, they were holding a deflated one, and the court had just turned into cracked concrete. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of awkward silence you don't normally hear in a neighborhood that size. No sprinklers clicking to life, no hum of air conditioning compressors, no happy kids running through backyard hoses. It was as if the entire community had been dumped into a bowl of confusion and left to dry under the sun. The HOA group chat was a war zone. Some residents were demanding Karen resign immediately, Others were asking if they had to boil rainwater, and at least 2 people were accusing me of eco-terrorism. But what none of them could argue with was the fact that I had done nothing illegal. Everything I had done so far was within my rights, well documented, thoroughly recorded, and legally protected. The real question wasn't about water anymore. It was about authority, and Karen was bleeding it out by the minute. She tried to rally support. She posted a long message in the app declaring that I had weaponized natural resources, and called me a menace to the harmony of the community. She claimed I had lied about ownership, that the lake was a shared body of water, and that I had forged my documentation. That last part was especially rich considering the actual documents were already reviewed by the county water department. But it was clear she wasn't trying to convince me. She was trying to cling to power by convincing the people still on the fence. The problem was, the fence was collapsing beneath her. By noon, I received a call from Officer Delgado, a local sheriff's deputy who had patrolled the area for years. He was laughing when he spoke. Apparently, Karen had marched into the sheriff's office demanding I be arrested for public endangerment and hostile control of utilities. The sheriff had calmly reviewed the documents I had submitted weeks ago when I first noticed the HOA rerouting water through my property. He even had a copy of the easement termination clause printed out. Delgado told me the sheriff politely informed Karen that if she pushed the issue, she might be the one facing legal consequences, possibly even charges for tampering with private infrastructure when they cut my pipe. She stormed out, apparently yelling about calling the governor. That part made me laugh out loud. But things took a sharper turn that evening. Around 9:30 p.m., my motion cameras triggered an alert near the lake valve. At first, I thought it might be wildlife. But when I checked the footage, my jaw tightened. A man in a dark hoodie was creeping through the fence near the valve station. He pulled out a set of bolt cutters and started working the lock. He wasn't a professional. His movements were clumsy, and he kept checking over his shoulder. I zoomed in on his face, just as he looked up toward one of the hidden cameras. I knew that face. It was Todd Wilbur, Karen's brother-in-law. A guy who'd previously tried to run a lawn care business without a license and once sprayed weed killer on a neighbor's vegetable garden by accident. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Delgado arrived 10 minutes later and caught Todd red-handed, still fiddling with the locked control box. I met them at the edge of the lake as Todd sat handcuffed on a folding chair, muttering something about how he was just trying to help the community. Karen showed up not long after, clearly having been tipped off. She tried to deflect, claiming Todd was acting on his own, but Todd had already told Delgado that Karen encouraged him to make things right before the Monday board meeting. Delgado took down both their statements, and while Todd was released pending charges, Karen was officially issued a warning. Her reputation was crumbling fast and loud. The news spread within hours. Someone leaked the camera footage to the community group. I had nothing to do with that part, though I didn't lose any sleep over it. The video showed everything. Todd sneaking in, fiddling with the pipes, and then getting hauled away in front of my motion-activated floodlights. The caption read, "HOA water crisis escalates, attempted sabotage caught on camera." By morning, local news outlets had picked up the story. A van with a news channel logo parked outside the HOA office by midday, and a reporter stood at the curb giving a live update with the headline, "Lake owner locks out HOA, water rights dispute makes waves." Karen tried to schedule a closed-door emergency HOA meeting, but several board members refused to attend unless it was open to the entire community. That was the beginning of the end for her. I decided to attend. I had no obligation to show up, but I wanted to be there for what I knew would be her unraveling. The meeting was held in the community hall, a converted storage building with cheap folding chairs and a sound system that whined every time someone moved the mic. I walked into a mix of stares and murmurs. Some people glared. Others nodded. A few even whispered thank yous. Karen stood at the front with a clipboard, her voice pinched and strained as she tried to call the meeting to order. She was clearly rattled. She started with a speech about unity and miscommunication, painting herself as a misunderstood leader trying to do what was best for everyone. Then she tried to bring the conversation back to me. She accused me again of manipulating the system, of hoarding water, of refusing to be a team player. I waited until she paused for breath and then calmly asked for the mic. I walked up, held out a stack of documents, and read from the county's official letter confirming my ownership and easement right. Then I read the violation codes she'd broken by tampering with my property. Then I played the camera footage on a small projector I had brought, just in case anyone still had doubt. When the clip ended and Todd's face froze on the screen mid-grimace, no one said a word. Then someone in the back let out a single loud chuckle. It was contagious. Soon the entire room was buzzing with laughter, muttering, and the quiet sound of Karen's power dissolving. One board member stood up and made it official. A motion to remove Karen as HOA president was proposed and seconded within 30 seconds. They voted, and the result was overwhelming. Karen stood there frozen, mouth twitching as she tried to process it. Someone in the audience yelled that she should apologize. Another yelled that she should reimburse residents for the party disaster. But she didn't speak. She turned and left the room in silence, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield that had already failed. After the meeting, I was approached by the interim president, a soft-spoken woman named Helena who had always stayed neutral. She apologized for the HOA's actions, said they'd cover the cost to repair the pipe, and asked if I'd consider restoring water service. I nodded. I told her the valve would be reopened by nightfall. But I also told her one more thing. I'd be drafting a new agreement. One that acknowledged the lake's ownership, formalized water usage terms, and ensured something like this never happened again. She agreed immediately. As I walked home, the air felt lighter. Not just because the water was about to flow again, but because the hold Karen had over the neighborhood had finally snapped. All it took was one pipe, one lake, and one very patient man with a plan. By the time I reopened the valve that evening, the pressure in the main line hissed like a tired dragon waking from a forced nap. I watched the gauges stabilize, then stepped back as the system hummed back to life, silently sending water through the buried pipes into every home that had been dry for the past 36 hours. Lights blinked green. The pumps whirred steadily. And just like that, the neighborhood exhaled in relief. Lawn sprinklers resumed their gentle clicks, hoses sputtered into action, and a few windows lit up with cheers from kids who could finally refill their kiddie pools. But even with the water flowing again, the story was far from over. What had happened wasn't just a plumbing mishap or an internal HOA drama, it had become a public embarrassment, one that was spiraling far beyond the borders of our small lakeside community. The next morning, a second news van showed up, this time from a regional network. A reporter stood outside the HOA office asking residents if they were aware their water had been coming from private property all along. One man, still in pajama pants, said he just wanted to water his tomatoes without getting caught in a legal war. Another woman, more enthusiastic, said she hoped the HOA finally learned what accountability meant. Karen's face, meanwhile, was now the star of a viral meme circulating local forums. A freeze frame from the dunk tank party, where she stood fuming next to a dry slide while kids wailed in the background, had been captioned with, "When you cut the pipe but forget who owns the lake." It was spreading like wildfire, and I didn't even have to lift a finger. The interim HOA board wasted no time implementing changes. They issued a formal apology, not just in the group app but also in a printed letter slid under every door. It acknowledged my ownership, admitted to their unlawful pipe severing, and promised structural changes to how future decisions would be made. But more importantly, it included a clause stating that any infrastructure tied to private property required direct owner consent going forward. That one sentence alone was worth more than a dozen court rulings. I had it framed in my office. Still, something didn't sit right. Karen had gone too quiet. Ever since her removal, she had vanished from every group, every thread, and every meeting. Todd had pleaded guilty to misdemeanor trespass, and was slapped with a hefty fine and a suspended sentence, but Karen hadn't been charged yet. I found that odd. Someone who had fought so aggressively for control didn't just disappear overnight. I had a gut feeling she wasn't finished. That hunch proved accurate the following Thursday, when I received a certified letter from her lawyer. It was a civil notice. Karen was attempting to sue me for defamation, loss of community standing, and personal damages resulting from malicious water manipulation. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so absurd. The letter claimed that I had weaponized my ownership of a natural resource to target her, caused emotional distress, and participated in what she called intentional humiliation through public exposure. I laughed for a full minute before calling my lawyer, who sounded even more amused than I was. But we didn't take it lightly. He drafted a full rebuttal, listing every county approval, ownership certificate, legal easement document, and video timestamp of her and Todd's violations. We sent it to her attorney with a clear warning: proceed and we countersue for property damage, trespassing, and defamation. We included a list of witnesses from the board meeting and a copy of the sheriff's incident report. The case never saw a courtroom. 2 days later, Karen's lawyer quietly withdrew the complaint. I imagine the conversation they must have had when he realized she was trying to sue the one guy who not only had all the documents but also had the media on his side. That probably didn't go well. Around the same time, the HOA hosted a town hall to begin rebuilding trust. They invited me to speak, and I agreed. Not out of pride, but because I knew people needed to understand what had actually happened. That it wasn't just about one woman cutting a pipe, but about the danger of unchecked power. I stood in front of a packed room and explained how I had no intention of weaponizing anything, that the water line had been left alone for years without issue, and that it was only after someone tried to control what didn't belong to them that problems began. I could see heads nodding, a few embarrassed faces, and even a couple of quiet apologies afterward from people who had once taken Karen's side. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a reality check, and most people appreciated the honesty. To ensure history didn't repeat itself, I met with the new board to draft a water usage agreement that locked in clear terms: how much water they could pull, for what purposes, who maintained the shared infrastructure, and what protocols would be followed in the event of dispute. It was official, signed by both parties, and filed with the county. No loopholes. No gray areas. I even included a clause that required a written 30-day notice before any physical alterations to shared lines. They agreed instantly. With stability returning, I decided to take a final step toward closure. I hired a landscaping company to install a custom fountain right in front of the HOA office. It wasn't massive, just elegant enough to draw attention. At its base, a bronze plaque read, "Water is a shared gift. Respect the source." Most people smiled when they saw it. A few laughed. Karen, however, was nowhere to be found. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks after the incident, a white sedan rolled up to my house. A delivery driver stepped out, holding a padded envelope. Inside was a postcard. No return address, just a sunset photo and one short message in cramped handwriting. "Enjoy your lake, Lord of the Pipes. I've moved on to where people know who's in charge." I flipped the card over. It was signed, begrudgingly, with AK. I stared at it for a moment, then walked down to the edge of the lake and skimmed a pebble across the surface. Karen might have thought the fight was about control, but she never understood it was really about responsibility. Owning something doesn't mean lording it over others. It means knowing how and when to draw a line, and knowing what to do when someone else crosses it. With the sun setting over my lake and the distant hum of happy neighbors finally living in peace, I felt something I hadn't felt since the whole saga began. Satisfaction. Not because I had won, but because I had fixed what was broken, and because I had done it without ever needing to raise my voice or break a single law. Sometimes, all it takes is knowing which valve to turn, and when to turn it. Summer eventually settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that makes you forget how wild things had gotten just weeks before. Lawns turned green again, kids rode bikes through the streets without dodging potholes or angry HOA enforcers, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community instead of a battlefield. With Karen gone and the new board functioning more like actual neighbors than petty tyrants, people seemed to breathe easier. But even though the storm had passed, I wasn't interested in simply letting the past wash away. Some things needed to be built stronger than before, and I had no intention of letting that lake or the power it represented become a future target for anyone else. That meant locking in every lesson we'd learned the hard way and ensuring the water flowed with purpose, not politic. One of my first steps was filing a revised set of easement protections through the county, clauses that went beyond simple usage agreements and extended into emergency protocols, infrastructure repairs, and jurisdictional boundaries. These new protections meant no HOA, present or future, could ever attempt what Karen did without triggering automatic breach consequences. I also set up a system of tiered water access levels tied directly to neighborhood cooperation, so if the HOA board ever veered back into chaos, I could limit their secondary usage without affecting primary residential flows. Some called it overkill. I called it smart insurance. But legal armor wasn't enough. I wanted the message to be cultural, embedded in the way people thought about the lake itself. So I began organizing monthly lake cleanup events, community picnics, and educational sessions on water conservation. What started as a handful of curious families soon became a popular event. Kids would show up with nets and buckets, picking out trash and learning how runoff affected fish populations. Parents brought food, volunteers set up music, and slowly, the lake became not just a utility, but a source of pride. It transformed from background scenery into something people wanted to protect. That's when I realized something deeper had happened. Karen's attempt to weaponize the HOA's authority had failed, but it had forced everyone to choose sides. And in doing so, it revealed how many people had been silently enduring the HOA's reign of nonsense simply to avoid conflict. With that fear gone, people were more willing to speak up, to question rules that made no sense, and to hold their leaders accountable. A woman who'd once been fined for painting her mailbox blue now headed the communications committee. A single dad who had been cited for non-compliant patio furniture started hosting weekend barbecues open to everyone. It was like the entire community had remembered it was allowed to enjoy itself. Still, the wounds weren't entirely healed. One afternoon, while adjusting the irrigation sensors near the lake's edge, I noticed a pair of teenagers sneaking around the back trail that led to the old pump shed. They weren't doing anything malicious, just poking around, curious. I called out, and they froze like deer in headlights. I waved them over and explained how the pump worked, how the system fed into the neighborhood, and why it had once become a battleground. They listened, wide-eyed, then asked the question I knew was coming. Did I really shut off the water during a party just to prove a point? I laughed and said no, I shut it off because someone broke the rules, and that when people mess with what they don't understand, the consequences usually show up holding a wrench. After they left, I sat there a while, thinking about how easily this all could have gone wrong. If I'd acted impulsively, or if I didn't have the documents to back me up, things could have spiraled into an expensive legal war, or worse. Instead, the simple truth had done all the heavy lifting. Karen had assumed that authority was about control, but she forgot the part where it's supposed to come with responsibility and respect. That had been her downfall, thinking she could rule without consequence. But even she had finally accepted the outcome, at least outwardly. Last I heard, she'd moved to a different HOA community 2 counties over, one with a reputation for stricter enforcement and residents too busy to care. Fitting, really. Someone told me she tried running for the board there too. She lost by a landslide. But the final chapter in all of this came unexpectedly. A few months after the storm had blown over and life returned to normal, I got a letter. Not a complaint or a legal threat, but a formal invitation. The Regional Homeowners Association Conference wanted me to speak on a panel about infrastructure ownership and conflict resolution. At first, I laughed it off. Me? A speaker? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was a chance to share a story most people never heard until it was too late. So I went. The panel was held in a large convention center filled with people who looked exactly like you'd expect: board members, suburban planners, and a few wide-eyed new homeowners wondering what they'd signed up for. I told them everything. About the pipe, the lake, the shutdown, and the dunk tank meltdown. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them how fast things fall apart when egos outpace empathy. And when I mentioned that the best fix wasn't a lawsuit, but a block party and a public fountain, the crowd actually applauded. Afterward, people asked me questions, some offered their own horror stories, and a few admitted they wished someone like me lived in their neighborhood. I wasn't a hero. I was just the guy who said enough. When I returned home, the neighborhood had left a surprise. A handmade sign posted near the lake's entrance. It had been painted by one of the community kids, a little crooked but proud. It said, "Welcome to Peace Lake. Take only what you need. Give back what you can." I stood there for a long time, reading those words over and over. The message wasn't mine, but it might have been the best summary of everything that had happened. And it wasn't just about water. It was about the principle behind it: resources, respect, and responsibility. I never wanted to be the guy who held the whole community's supply line in his hand. But when they forced me into that position, I chose to be fair, even when I could have been ruthless. That's what kept me sane through the chaos. And that's what changed the neighborhood more than any pipe or valve ever could. In the end, all I really wanted was to be left alone to enjoy my home and my lake. But when they challenged that, I didn't just defend it. I made sure it would never need defending again. Now, when I walk by the shoreline in the evening, the water is calm, the pumps are quiet, and the people are content. The sound of sprinklers in the distance, the laughter of kids, and the gentle rippling of the lake have replaced arguments, threats, and dry faucets. The war over water is long over. But the legacy of what we built afterward is just beginning. And it all started with one reckless decision, one silent lake, and one man who refused to be bullied by a plastic sign and a clip-on badge.